So a quick introduction. Jon Kahl is a professor at UW-Milwaukee. He got all of his degrees here at the University of Michigan. So he didn't start out in climate and atmospheric science. He specializes in air pollution meteorology, long-range atmospheric transport, air trajectory modeling, enhanced science education using technology. He's the director of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Atmospheric Science Study Abroad in Mexico, Air Pollution in Ancient Cultures. And this is offered every January. It's still being, oh, that's awesome. And he's the author of 7 children's books about meteorology. That's cool. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So, little perspective for you guys, for me, my little history. So I graduated in 1981. I had changed my major 5 times as an undergrad. And I changed again in grad school. But I was pre-dental twice. I was a music major for a while, psychology. And after, when I was getting to my 4th year, I did a little analysis and I saw that if I chose psychology, I could graduate with having to take the fewest additional courses. So that's what I did. But along the way, I took a meteorology class from Don Portman. And when I was having my identity crisis, that was a joke that we had back then. You know, you graduate from college and you have an identity crisis. So I was having mine. I had to figure what I want to do, and I decided I didn't want to have a career in psychology. So I had this very memorable night where I went through my 2 boxes of notebooks, paging through, reliving all of my courses, and I found that, to my surprise, I was, at least at that moment, most interested in the notebook that I had from Don Portman's meteorology class. So I went and talked to a graduate advisor here, who happened to be Fred Bartman. And I said, okay, you know, what do I need to do to come back and get a 2nd bachelor's degree? And he looked at my transcript and he said, you know, you can go right into the master's program. So, you know, indecision, it paid off. I accidentally took all the right classes, you know, calculus and physics and stuff like that. So I began my master's program, and a couple of important things from my personal development happened that very first week. So it was, I guess, research activities building across the street. What direction? There. Yeah. So I was assigned an office, and it was during the first week in class. I went there and I was very nervous because I didn't know anybody and it was a new field for me. All I had was 1 intro class in meteorology, and now I was on a graduate program. Very nervous about the whole thing. I happened to walk in and they were in the middle of this 10 o'clock coffee hour that someone mentioned. And so Fred Bartman was sitting at the table. And he had met me, and so he was very kind, and he invited me to sit down, and he introduced me around. And I'm trying to remember, Ed Reisner was there, and Don Portman, who totally didn't remember me from taking his class a few years back, and Bruce Baker. So I was meeting all the people, and Bruce Baker, who I became friends with and I'm still in touch with to this day, he sort of talked to me the most during that little meeting. And I said, oh, so you're a graduate student here? Yeah. How long have you been here? I asked him. He said, 10 years. Oh, my God. So, yeah, that sort of set the scene for me, set the stage. Then let's see. At the time I had a part-time job working as a cashier at a liquor store on State Street. I didn't like that job. We got held up twice. A fellow cashier got held up at knife point while I was working there. Didn't like that job, wanted to leave. And I looked on the job board somewhere, and Perry Samson, whoever that was advertising for a data entry assistant. So I applied. I could type.
Wait, I was better than a liquor store.
Yes. Don't worry.
Thank you.
Just remember. So I started working with Perry, and you know, I liked Perry and he liked me, and I got progressively increasing responsibilities, and he ended up being my master's advisor and invited me to go on afterwards to a PhD, and that's how it started. So these years in the red box here, those were like the glory years for me. I mean, I look back now and these were like some of the best years of my life. So, I did a postdoc at a NOAA lab in Boulder, and then in 1990, I started my current job, which I've had for now 33 years. So, putting together this talk, this was really hard. Thank you, Perry. I got somewhere between varied and little advice about what I was actually supposed to do, and the best I could understand the advice, it was some cross between a roast and a career retrospective. And neither of those ideas worked because 20 minutes, not nearly enough time for a roast.
Oh, the career part.
Yeah. And the career retrospective, I looked at the people page of the department website, see who's still here. And there were a couple professors beside Perry that were still here from my time. Sushil Atreya. Now I understand that he is not here physically that often, but one or two others, I thought, okay, I can't do a career retrospective because those guys remember all the ridiculous things I did in their classes. That's not going to work. So I thought, well, it's the holiday season, so we'll start with this. So I was with Perry for what, 7 years or something. So I have a lot of grievances.
Can't go well.
So let's start with the first one. Does anybody remember this?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Codolith. So Perry instilled in his gaggle of grad students the need to make good quality presentation graphics. I mean, the background has to be dark, to soothe the eyes of the audience. And the foreground has to be light. And we use Codolith film, which I had never heard of before. It's some kind of high contrast film. And when we made our lecture slides, the photographic slides, we had to print out graphs like 5 different ways, without the lines on the graph and just the axes and just the text around the axes. And we go to this lab where they had cameras mounted on tripods, and we had to, buy Codolith film, put it in there, and you take photos, several photos with filters, and you make these fancy lecture slides. So thank you for this, Perry. I to this day tell my students, nope, background has to be dark, foreground has to be light. Nope, too much blank real estate on the slide, not good. You got to
I
read
have to add something here, because that whole concept came from the fellow I was working with on campus, Rick Ridley, whose son you all know is Aaron.
Okay, all I know was it's this annoying thing we had to do.
And he's still annoying. Sure.
Okay. So going on with grievances. These aren't really grievances. Let's call them fond memories. Okay. So remember when we used to have phones in our offices and people used to call you on the phone, and sometimes like secretary would get the call and transfer it to you, So I remember Perry, he would always answer the phone and say, Perry. And I heard him pick up the phone and say, Perry, many times. And I thought, that's kind of cool. It's a unique, distinctive way to answer the phone. Now, Perry isn't the most common of names, so okay, maybe it's unique because of that. But I thought, when I come into my own, I want to have a unique way to answer the phone. So I ruled out Perry right away. But so I would say, hello, this is John. So short and to the point, but that's what I always did. All the years that I got phone calls, I answered it. Hello, this is John, because of you. Because I always think, okay, gotta do it the same way, because Perry always said Perry. So, so you never know the effect that you have on your students. Yeah. So I remember when I started my professor job, sometime maybe in the first month of my job, I was feeling completely overwhelmed. Any of you professors in the room know this feeling, I had to develop classes and I had to apply for research grants, and there was a pile of HR paperwork. I had all the students, all this stuff. I was feeling completely overwhelmed. So I called Perry up and I said, how do you do it? And he said, it's easy. You just have to learn how to manage panic. And I remember thinking, oh, that's not helpful, but it kind of was, because it was kind of right. So, all right, another thing I remember about Perry was that he always had the greatest stories, and I remember all these stories just from back in the time that I was around here. There's one story about he went to California to meet with a project manager at a funding agency, and the project manager pulled out the Perry's proposal, and it was face down in a drawer in the desk. Just because, how do I get my proposal out of your drawer in the desk? I remember there was another story about he was at some conference and sent his clothes to the laundry, and they came back soaking wet and smelling like chemicals. There was some conference in Greece, and there was something that happened in Corfu that I had to promise never to repeat. So I looked at it. But he had all these stories, and I remember thinking that when I come into my own, I want to have some stories too. So I have some. So I thought that's what I would do with this time here, is tell you some of my stories. So here's the first one. When I was doing my postdoc in Boulder at a lab that was then called Climate Monitoring, CMDL, Climate Monitoring and Diagnostics Lab. I was working with a group that was studying the Arctic air pollution problem called Arctic haze. And the group was all chemists. They have these instruments, they put them on the ground, they fly them in an airplane, concentrations go up, they go down. Nobody knew why. The answer, of course, as Jeff told us, is meteorology, right? So it was my job to figure that out. And my job specifically was to model the transport of these Arctic haze pollutants from the source regions, which were typically in Siberia, to the United States and Canadian portion of the Arctic where they're measured. And so this is a graphic that I used to show back in those days. Note the dark background, right? That shows that United States, continental United States drawn to scale just to illustrate the size of the Arctic Ocean. And the Arctic Ocean was at that time completely data sparse. No surface stations, no upper air stations. So when I started my job, I realized that that was a brick wall right there. I had to do this modeling and there was no data. Back in those days, the late 80s, the state of gridded meteorological data sets was, in its infancy. They were not very good data sets. So that was one problem. And I learned of another problem, which is this pesky Arctic temperature inversion, which is an omnipresent thing. And that is totally relevant to the movement of pollution over long distances. So there's no data. So how am I going to handle that? So it was a very frustrating time. I buried myself in the library in Boulder, reading everything I could think of, trying to figure out how to get around these two problems. And right around that time, I went to a conference in Cambridge, England. It was a air pollution modeling conference. And so one afternoon, I played hooky from the conference, walked around the town. It was cool. I'd never been to England before. And as I was walking around, I found myself in front of this building. This building is the Scott Polar Research Institute. And it's a place that I had read about in my hiding in the library in Boulder, trying to learn everything I could about Arctic meteorology. This was at the time one of the 3 places in the world that focused on polar research. And I had completely forgot that it was in Cambridge and I was going to Cambridge. So I thought that's cool, like a unplanned serendipity, wow. So I went inside and they had a small library in the basement. And in the library, they had these 2 bookshelves that had meteorology books in them. And on those bookshelves, I found these 2 books. And I can't read Russian, but I can read numbers. And inside the books were, about this thick worth of tables of radiosonde data over the Arctic Ocean. I could tell from the latitudes and longitudes, it was interior Arctic Ocean. And from the dates, it was like in the 50s. And I thought, holy crap, the data that I need does exist. And this discovery, which just came from playing hooky from a conference, led to a research direction that I was in for 10 years. So I learned that there exists these things called ice islands. They're drifting ice flows embedded in the surrounding pack ice that are thicker than surrounding ice, and they can support structures and airplanes. This is a picture taken by a Canadian Air Force jet of one of the Russian stations. And on these ice stations, they made lots of geophysical measurements, including weather balloon radiosonde measurements. And the radiosonde measurements was a much heralded event because they couldn't just go to Home Depot and get a new tank of helium. They had to manufacture their own hydrogen gas, and it was super dangerous. But they did it twice a day for years on these drifting ice flows. So I managed over the course of 10-year project in total to get my hands on all of the Russian ice station radiosonde data, and put together an archive and made that available to the world, and did all kinds of analysis mainly on the temperature inversion. As far as transport across the Arctic, we ended up using gridded data sets after all for that part. But yeah, so there's one story for you, Perry. Okay, I got another one. So anyone who's taken a micrometeorology class, I think maybe has PTSD about the Novikov similarity theory. I took a micrometeorology class here. I think it was from Portman and not from you, I think. I remember we learned about this stuff, and there's this, ugly Mona Novikov length that we talked about all the time. And I finished that class probably with a decent grade, not understanding what it was or anything. And it was only years later when I started teaching the micrometeorology course in Milwaukee that I finally figured out what it was. But anyways, so when I was in my 10-year period of working with Russian ice station data, I had a lot of collaborations with Russian scientists because they wouldn't let that data out of the country. What I had to do was get NSF grants and feed some of the money to them, and they would do the data inputs, and then I would get the data that way. So I had a few trips to Russia, and during one of these trips, I was giving a talk at the Central Aerological Observatory in Moscow. And this was the first time I had given a talk that was translated. So I'm giving this talk and I'm saying some stuff. And then this lady named Nina, who was my translator, she would jabber in Russian and translate. And then it was my turn and I would say some more stuff. And while Nina was jabbering, she always seemed to be talking for way longer than it took me to say my stuff. And I didn't understand what she was saying, but yeah. As she was doing that, I found my attention wandering. So as she's doing that, I just have to stand here. I'm looking around the room, just checking things out. It was a long, narrow room. And one of the times my gaze found some guy sitting in the back row, which was much deeper than this room, sort of where you are, your position. And he was wearing a monocle. And I had never before, ever before or since, seen anyone wearing a monocle. It was like the Mr. Peanut guy, And so there's my turn to talk again. Okay, forget about the monocle. Now then, okay, so jabber in Russian. Now I can look again. And so I just was transfixed. I was obsessed. This guy's wearing a monocle. My mind was wandering with all this crazy stuff. I'm thinking like, wow, isn't that cool? Wow, I wonder if he's gonna take it off and clean it. Wouldn't that be cool? And thinking all of a sudden, what if he dropped it and it rolled to the front and I could pick it up and courteously return it to him. Wouldn't that be cool? Just this crazy stuff. Anyways, I got through my talk, and at the end of it, a bunch of people came up to talk to me. And after it was all done, I looked and monocle guy was gone. But I asked Nina, the translator, who obviously spoke English, did you see that guy in the back wearing the monocle? And she said, oh, you mean academician Obakov? That was Obakov. So I like to say that I met Obakov. It's almost true, right? Well, anyways, so the story doesn't end there. So like my hobby is playing guitar in a rock band. And the name of my band is Iron Monica. And that goes back to Obakov. And when we had a beer infused discussion with my band buddies about what should we name the band, I lobbied very strongly for Obakov's monocle. And I got close, you know. So, yeah, all because of my Michigan training, Perry. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, got another story for you. So in my micrometeorology class here at Michigan, I learned that when water freezes, it expands. And it has something to do with like soil moisture and, you know, all kinds of stuff, meteorology stuff. Well, anyways, when I was doing my postdoc in Boulder, I was a brand new homeowner. And back in those days, phone calls got routed through like a central message office or whatever. I had been out to lunch, came back, there was a note on my door that said, your wife called, go right home, don't call first. So, okay, so I rushed home. And now my wife is a violin teacher. She teaches Suzuki violin. She did that in Boulder and she's done it continuously in Milwaukee. Well, at that time, among her students were the kids of this guy, Rulon Jones, who was a defensive lineman for the Denver Broncos. And he had a pile of kids. And when Rulon was in town, he would bring the kids. So I met Rulon many times at my house. He was a super nice guy, like a gentle giant kind of guy. His hand was huge and all his fingers were having been broken many times, you know. But anyway, so I rushed in the house and I go to where Carol, my wife, is teaching. And, you know, and she says, Rulon will show you. Rulon was there with his kids. So he beckons me and takes me downstairs where there's water. And he explains, he says that, you know, a pipe broke. He said, probably what you did is you forgot to turn off the spigot inside the house, which is exactly what happened. I didn't even know you're supposed to do that. And he told me I turned the water main off, showed me where it was, and he advised me on how to fix the problem. And so I took a couple of days off work and you know, wet vacs and fans and fixed everything. Well, anyways, when I was all done, the very last thing to do was to move the washing machine back. Rulon had moved it out of the way to access the water shutoff. Well, I didn't notice it until that moment, but Rulon had placed the washing machine on top of the dryer. So even if I was strong enough to lift it, which I wasn't, it was just, I couldn't do it, right? So I got a neighbor to help me, came over, okay, ready? Okay, on 3, 1, 2, 3, and we couldn't budget at all. Didn't understand. So I got a step ladder and I looked and the washer was full of water and clothes. So this defensive lineman guy had to lift it up. He probably only used one hand. So I had to siphon the water out and fish the clothes out. And then my neighbor and I could move it down. But anyways, so I got great training here at Michigan. Some of the best years of my life allowed me to generate some stories. So anyways, congratulations, Perry. And thank you for inviting me here.
I thought you were gonna say the football player told you the water expands.
Thanks, John. That was great.